Hello and welcome to EESC 315. This is our course on environmental impact assessment, techniques, and practice. I'm going to be using a series of background photos throughout the semester. A lot of them will focus on the Peace River and the W.A.C. Bennett Dam and the Site C Dam, which is going to be built on the Peace River. That's going to be the focus of our case study for our major project this semester. So today I'll talk about the course syllabus. I'll go through what we intend to cover in the course, what are the learning objectives, how is the grading going to be done. I'll also talk a little bit about what is environmental impact assessment. I'll go over the Site C Clean Energy Project, or Site C as it's more commonly known. So Site C is a dam that's presently being built on the Peace River. There was an environmental impact statement, or an EIS, which is pretty much the same as an EIA, done for the Site C Dam between about 2010 and 2012. I worked on that project myself, so I have some experience with that, and I'm going to use that throughout this course to help you learn about environmental impact assessment. I'll talk a bit about environmental modeling. That's usually a key component of an environmental impact assessment. So to get a hold of me, my name is Jerry Vandenberg. This is my phone number and my email. These are really the two best ways to get a hold of me. I do have an office in the FIPKI building, but I'm rarely there as there's virtually no on-campus work for undergraduates, as you undoubtedly know this semester. So for the rest of winter 2021, the best way to reach me is going to be by email. I'll be attending labs in person. Most lectures will be pre-recorded, as I'll talk about. But once a week for 2 hours, we'll be together in lab, so you can get a hold of me there for sure. And then if we need to talk about something in private, I can book some separate time, either by phone or by Collaborate Ultra or Zoom or some other sort of virtual in-person format. So that's how to get a hold of me this semester. And so this is what we want to learn this semester. So it's really going to be all about learning skills. You probably have taken EESC 314 by now. I know it's not a prerequisite, but it will certainly have helped if you have taken that course. And that's really the big picture of environmental impact assessment. This semester, we're going to focus on the skills and the hands-on techniques that a person or a practitioner would use to complete an EIA. Again, we'll focus a lot on environmental modeling. That'll be the focus of the labs. In most of the lectures, I will have a couple of lectures on modeling, but most of the lectures are going to be on the overall components of an environmental impact assessment. How are all the different disciplines done? How do they fit together? We're also going to be talking about project management. With any sort of large multidisciplinary project like an EIA, there's a necessity of having a strong project manager who can tie together the different components and make sure they all fit together and get done on time. And lastly, to understand how to determine the significance and environmental consequence of a project. So with any large environmental project, there will be some impact. The big question for decision makers, and by decision makers I mean the owners of the project or the regulators who need to decide whether that project will be approved. The big question is there going to be a significant adverse impact? In other words, what is the environmental consequence? And so that's really where we're headed with this course, is to understand, yes, every project will have impacts, but are those projects going to have a significant adverse impact on the environment and on society more generally? So here are some of the topics that we'll be looking at in this course. And I have to say, I really like environmental impact assessment because it's very multidisciplinary. And if you're doing any sort of earth and environmental science, you will have to interact with other types of components. So in other words, if you are focusing on biology, you'll also need to relate to the geologists and understand how they came to get their information. You'll need to understand how the chemists are out measuring water, how the wildlife biologists are out measuring the moose. All of these different components of the environment need to fit together into a big story that helps us understand the overall impact. And so in this multidisciplinary setting, we're going to have some general skills such as report writing, project management, and modeling that are really applicable to any of these different subdisciplines, but then we will also have individual components or elements of an environmental impact assessment And these are what we will work on as within our individual expertise, but tying together with the broader picture. So scoping in terms of reference, this defines an overall environmental impact assessment. It sets the terms that we must work within and the specific items that we must include in the EIA. Conceptual models and linkages, these are tools to help us understand what are the processes, the mechanisms, the pathways that can go from a project to the effect on usually some biological receptor. We'll have a lecture on that to help you fully understand how those linkages work. We'll talk about baseline studies. Baseline studies are environmental studies that define the environment today or in the past before a project starts. And we can then use that baseline to compare future predictions or future effects. After the project is built, we need to predict some change, and we'll compare that to the baseline. We'll talk about different methods of assessing effects, because no matter which component we're working on, whether it's water quality, air quality, human health, wildlife, noise, any of these disciplines or components, we need some method of assessing some change and then determining whether that change is significant. So we'll go over some of the main components. I'm planning on having a lot of guest lecturers come in, specialists who work in the field who can talk about things like air quality, human health impacts, things where my expertise is fairly limited. And so hopefully I've secured enough different experts to come in to cover the entire gamut of an EIA. We'll see. It's sometimes tough to get guest lecturers, but I've got sort of tentative commitments, and we'll see how the term goes. Okay, so in addition, additional elements of an environmental impact assessment. So we'll need to do an alternatives assessment, and I'll go through an alternatives assessment in detail. And as we'll talk about later in the semester, there are different types of alternatives assessments. We'll talk about risk assessment and significance determination, so understanding how significant a specific effect might be on the environment. We'll talk about public participations and hearings. This is usually the end of an EIA process when the practitioners have completed their report, it's been out for public review, and now in a very formal, called a quasi-judicial type setting, the general public and interveners and other interested stakeholders can come and question the practitioners and the proponent to try and understand, are there any effects or are there any uncertainties that we can dig into here to better understand the project? And this is all aimed at helping the decision makers understand whether a project should be approved. And that leads us into the next topic, which is approvals, conditions, and follow-up monitoring. So even though the environmental impact assessment might be completed, at the point where the project is now approved and the proponent can go ahead and build the project, they still need to do a lot of follow-up. So they need to follow a lot of conditions that'll be in their permit. They will have follow-up monitoring. They'll have to do adaptive management for some components where there's any residual uncertainty. So again, adaptive management is a way for proponents to carry out a project in the face of uncertainty, but progressively reducing that uncertainty as the project unfolds. So let's talk about evaluation and grading for the course. You'll see it's 50-50, so 50% of the mark will be derived from the laboratory project. It's not a lab project the way I think of a lab as a chemist. I think of using a spectrophotometer or something. It's really going to be a lot of computer work, so there will be computer modeling, project management, report writing, and combination of group and individual work. So it's really going to be broken down into two parts for the lab, and all of this will be done within groups. We'll talk about this more during our first lab. So we have a predictive report, which is going to be a modeling exercise. We're going to be using a modeling software called GoldSim, which is an industry standard for environmental impact assessments. And we'll have an assessment report. And the assessment report will focus on the Site C EIS, and it will look at all of the things we talk about in class. It will look in detail at the Site C EIS and try and understand, did they follow the best practices? Can we, the practitioners, in other words, you and I, can we evaluate what they did in the Site C EIS with enough detail to get some confidence and to understand their uncertainties, and really looking at everything we talk about in lectures, trying to apply that to how the Site C EIS was done. And so that's half the mark. Those are the lab reports. And so there will be two reports. The preliminary reports will be sort of an outline of the final report, which will be done a few weeks in advance, and it will help me give you some feedback before we go on to your final report, which is really worth 25% each. So a quarter of your overall mark, it's fairly high stakes. So we want to start with the preliminary report so I can give you some feedback. You can refine some things and hopefully do better on the final report. Okay, so then we'll have quizzes. We'll have Canvas quizzes, and these are going to be about every 3 weeks. They're only worth 5%, so it's not a huge high stakes quiz. Hopefully it helps us keep up to date with our lecture material as the lecture goes on, and that'll be 20% of the overall mark. And then we'll have a final exam, just like any other final exam. And of course, this year, like most exams, it'll be on Canvas. So it'll be open book, timed, focusing mainly on lecture material. Now the quizzes, though, will focus also on the labs and lecture material. So a combination of both. So the labs are heavily weighted because this is a techniques course. So I want you to leave this course with some confidence that if you were to go work in the field of EIA, you would be able to sort of hit the ground running. But also, even if you don't, like I mentioned earlier, if you're going to be an earth or an environmental scientist, almost everything you do will require some sort of an environmental impact assessment. So it's good to know how these things are done, just so you can sort of get context for whatever work you end up doing. Okay, so the lab reports will be done in groups. As I'll talk about, there is an option to do them individually. It'll be a lot more work, but some people really prefer individual work, and I'm fine with that. But just be aware, it will be a lot of work. So, lecture format, most of the lectures will be pre-recorded. Sometimes it'll be me standing in front of a screen. Sometimes it'll be me replaying audio that I recorded last year. So I tend to record all of my lectures, even back when we were doing lectures in person. And some of my lectures I think are just fine in the format that I recorded them last year. So I'll just put the voiceover slides and post those. The other format will be sort of an interview format with guest lecturers. Some of those will be recorded and pre-posted. So anything that's pre-recorded, I will post to a YouTube site and I'll link to it from Canvas. So virtually everything, I think it is fair to say absolutely everything actually, that you will need to find for this course, you can find from Canvas, either as a link to a YouTube video or a link to an external site, for example, the BC Environmental Assessment Office and the Canadian Environmental Assessment Agency, CEA, that's the former agency. And the reason I'm using CEA is because our case study, the Site CEIS, is posted on the old CEA website. So most of the resources that I'll link to will be government resources, some guidance documents, legislation, sort of the government rules documents that we'll be using throughout the course. Okay, so pretty much everything you'll need you can find right on the main Canvas modules page. There will be a module for lectures, a module for labs, and then another module for external resources. Now, the exception to the main pre-recorded lectures will be some virtual guest lectures will be in person, not live in the flesh in person, but live during the time recorded via Collaborate Ultra. So this will be during the regularly scheduled class times. You'll need to actually attend those during the class times because some guest lecturers prefer not to be recorded because maybe some of the project case studies they talk about will be a little sensitive and they don't want it going online or anything like that. So the odd guest lecture will be in person only. Again, by in person, I mean during class times on Collaborate Ultra, virtually in person. So those you should attend. I will still try and record those in Collaborate Ultra, so they won't be online for the world to see, but they will be online for you to see via Canvas. Now, like I said, though, some people prefer not to be recorded, and in which case, in those cases, you will need to attend during class time or you'll miss it. So those will be the rare exceptions, but I will definitely post that on Canvas so that it's not a surprise to you. Now, this is kind of a weird thing on Collaborate Ultra. In order to find a recorded session, you need to click the little hamburger icon there, and it'll open up the side menu, and from there you can choose recordings. And then for some reason, Collaborate Ultra also hides the recorded lectures that are older than about a month old, and so then you can choose how the filter works in Collaborate Ultra to show all lectures if there's something that's not showing up in this list. So you've probably found that by now since we're into our third online semester, but just in case you haven't, remember that to find a recorded Collaborate Ultra session, you need to click on that icon to reveal this menu, okay? So the textbook, there isn't one. As I mentioned, I'll be referring to a lot of government sources online. So the good news for you is that you don't need to buy a textbook. Occasionally, I'll be referring to Kevin Hanna's textbook, which you can find copies of in the library if you hadn't bought one from being in EISC 314. But that'll be fairly infrequent, and most of the time I'll have it in my slides, so you won't need to buy a textbook. The case study that we're working with, the Site C case study, this is entirely online. I've got links to that already on Canvas, so you can go and look at the EIS in its entirety. And I'll be assigning a few readings during this lecture for you to go and have a look at. So lab reports. As I mentioned, there will be 4 reports. There will be an assessment report, which includes the full report and a preliminary report, and there will be a predictive report, which also includes a preliminary report and the full report. These should be done in groups. They will reflect both lecture material and lab material. So in lectures, I'll go over sort of generic information about EIAs. I will also bring up some specific information about the Site C EIS. And we'll also have the modeling work that is done as hands-on work in the lab, and then I'll talk about sort of modeling in a generic sense in the lectures. So all of this will feed into the lab reports. These can be done in groups or individually. I highly recommend doing them in groups. You can also self-select your groups. In fact, I would prefer that you select your own groups. It makes things easier for everybody if you've chosen your partners. However, if there are people left over who don't have partners, I will help you find partners. It's really good if you're forming groups to find groups that have complementary skills with each other. So in other words, somebody in the group will be a modeler, probably a couple of people. This will be somebody who's good with computer software, good with numbers, good with data, good with math. Somebody who's going to be a report writer, preferably somebody who's taken my 418 course. That would help a lot for your group. Somebody who's done project management, and if you don't have that skill set, don't worry, I'm going to be going over project management in a lot of detail. Somebody who's going to dig into the risk assessment or the impact assessment that was done by the proponent. In other words, somebody who wants to evaluate the Site C EIS. Probably this will be 1 or 2 people. So in other words, we'll have a group of about 5 people. Each group should have somebody who specializes in one of these areas. And don't worry if you don't feel like you specialize in these areas yet. It's more of an aspiration that throughout this semester, you will build those skills and specialize within your group in one of these areas. And this is exactly how it works in practice. In an environmental impact assessment that we would do in industry, there could be upwards of 400 or 500 people working on that environmental impact assessment, broken down into smaller components. And we'll go through how that works throughout the semester. Okay, so most of the labs can be done on your own time. There will be a few labs that you really definitely need to attend in person, and those are really the first 3 labs. So I'll talk about those first. So this week, the week of January 11th, definitely show up and we'll go over the orientation to the lab. We're going to be using remote labs. So there's software that you'll use through UBC that will allow you to log into different labs, computer labs that have our software installed on them, so GoldSim. And the nice thing about that is you don't need to install any software on your own computer. Everything is done through servers at UBC. Week 2, we're going to have an introduction to each other and to our groups, and we'll start talking about our group projects. And then in week 3, we want to have a lot of definition around our group projects, and we'll make sure that everybody within the group understands their role and that you and I understand your project and that it's going to be something that meets the objectives of the course. So definitely weeks 1 to 3 plan to attend in person. Now, weeks 4 and on, we'll focus on this GoldSim software. Even though you may not be the modeler in your group, you still need to learn this software at a basic level, and it will help you sort of understand environmental modeling in general. Even, like I say, even if you don't go on to build models, it's still really valuable information to understand how models work, because environmental models are used in lots of different fields, not just environmental impact assessment. So it's a really good skill to have as you leave this course. So during all lab times, not just the first 3 weeks, I will be there during lab time to help you with your project. I would recommend that you tend to drop in and at least log in at the start of lab and see if we have any questions. So I've taught this course only once before. That was in the first semester of 2020. And I did find that even when labs were in person, it was optional if you wanted to show up during lab time after the first few weeks. But I did find that we spent almost the entire lab time talking about projects. And so I think that if you're not there talking about your project and getting help as you go along, you're probably not going to do very well. So plan to be there most of the time. Again, I don't take attendance. It's totally up to you, but I think you'll have a hard time getting your project done if you don't attend most of the labs during that time. Okay, and so all labs will be on Collaborate Ultra, plus that remote software that we'll go over during your first lab for you to log into the GoldSim software. So I'll talk a little bit about environmental modeling. I'm going to talk a lot about it in detail in the upcoming lectures and in our labs, but really it's a central element of most EIA components. It's really the way that practitioners predict future effects. So there's lots of different types of environmental models. Really what we do is we take some process or some mechanism that we see in nature and we try and build some numerical algorithm around that to predict how it will change in the future. And now that might sound like a little bit of gibberish. Hopefully that makes sense as we move on. But really it's just a way of putting some quantitative prediction around an environmental effect. So that'll be the focus of our labs. Each group will develop one predictive model. So as you're looking through the case study, think of what you want to model as a practitioner. So the case study is going to be Site C. So it's a dam on a very large river. It's on the Peace River in northern BC, in case you're not familiar with Site C. So the types of models that you can do are actually quite varied. The obvious types of models are flow models. So a dam is going to change the hydrology of a river. It'll change the sediment transport. It'll change the chemical dynamics, the nutrients, the mercury generation. It will change the fish habitat. There will be noise associated with it. This was somewhat of a surprise to me, but last year 2 groups chose to do noise models, and that was fine. It was interesting. There will be air quality effects associated with the project, all sorts of different components. All of these things can be modeled in GoldSim. So give some thought to what type of model you would like to generate as a group. And I will just note here that modeling skills are in very high demand. So a lot of you are in probably 4th year and you're planning to graduate in April and go out and find a job. And if you are the modeler for your group and you enjoy that type of work, I strongly recommend putting that right near the top of your resume that you've got modeling skills. You'll almost definitely get an interview because I can tell you I've been working in industry for about 20 years and modelers have always been in high demand. We can never find enough junior modelers. So it's a really good skill to have and it's a good skill to put on your resume. So we'll be focusing on GoldSim. Here's a link to the GoldSim website. which you can also find on Canvas, so don't worry about writing that down. If you want to go and have a look at that now, you can. Otherwise, you can wait for our labs. But GoldSim it's a generic modeling platform. There are very specific types of models that you can download. For example, you can download a hydraulic model or a sediment transport model or a fish habitat model. GoldSim is a generic model. It's just a platform. In other words, it's a piece of software that we put our algorithms into to represent the natural environment. It doesn't have any built-in processes. It's completely wide open, which has some strengths and some weaknesses. So the weaknesses are if we wanted, say, a hydrodynamic model or a sediment transport model, we could go and get one off the USGS website and we wouldn't have to build it from scratch. And we know that it's been tested and we know that it's got the processes we want. So that's kind of the benefit of getting one of these off-the-shelf models. Now, the drawback of those models and the strength of GoldSim is that it's a blank slate to us. We can build any type of model we wanted, and we can combine different types of processes. So say we wanted a model that has a combination of a flow regime plus the water quality of the nutrients that will result from that, plus the primary productivity and the uptake of algae by fish. We could build all of that into GoldSim, and we don't need to have a whole bunch of other processes. We can focus on specifically what we want and only what we want. So that's kind of the nice part about having a flexible platform like GoldSim, is we can build anything we want. But again, the drawback there is that we need to do a lot of quality assurance. We need to do a lot of model testing. We need to understand exactly what we've built and that we know that it works properly without inducing errors. So pros and cons, we'll talk a lot about that. One thing that I would like to focus on this semester is model uncertainty. So this is something that a lot of people, even people who have been modeling, using models for many years, often don't have a good grasp on, is what is the true uncertainty of our model? All right, so let's talk about environmental impact assessment. And so throughout this course, you'll hear me use the term EIA, Environmental Impact Assessment, or EA, Environmental Assessment, or EIS, Environmental Impact Statement. Really, those are synonymous terms. They're used by different jurisdictions. From the perspective of the person who's doing the assessment, there is really no material difference between those. Different agencies might tell you differently, but as a person who's doing an environmental assessment, whether you call it an EA or an EIA or an EIS, doesn't really make much difference, okay? So what does an EIA do, or what is an EIA? So an EIA evaluates all relevant environmental and resulting social effects which would result from a project. These are all different definitions from different textbooks and different authoritative sources. And what I want to get across here is that they're all sort of similar but quite broad. Really what we're talking about is some large project is going to occur. We need to understand the environmental effects of that. We need to understand the social effects of that so that somebody can make a decision about whether that project should proceed. And equally importantly, we need to help the proponent. The proponent is the company or the operator that's going to build the project. We need to help the proponent understand what is the right level of mitigation. And mitigation is some way of reducing impacts. So that can mean building a water treatment plant, building a barrier wall to stop groundwater, building a noise barrier to keep the noise down, applying water to keep dust down, applying a scrubber to keep sulfur dioxide emissions down. Any of that, that's all mitigation. And those are just different methods that the proponent can apply to reduce environmental impacts. Okay, so I'll read a couple of more of these. EIA is an activity designed to identify and predict the impact on human health and well-being of legislative proposals, policies, programs, and operational procedures, and to interpret and communicate information about those impacts. So again, there's that element of communication in here. It's not just about determining the impacts, it's about communicating to the stakeholders what are those impacts, communicating to the decision makers, should we approve this project? EIA is the study of the full range of consequences, immediate and long range, intended and unanticipated, of the introduction of a new technology, project, or program. Now, what's interesting about this is the unanticipated. EIA is not a very good tool for predicting unanticipated impacts. And I say this as somebody who's worked on them for, like I say, about 2 decades. I can tell you EIA is very good about predicting the intended or the sort of anticipated consequences of a project. It's not so good when it comes to predicting unanticipated consequences. So EIA is a tool for identifying and predicting the impacts of projects and investigating and proposing means for their management. And again, this speaks to the mitigation. This is really about helping the proponent understand what is that level of mitigation that will help them reduce their impacts. EIA is a planning tool whose main purpose is to give the environment its due place in the decision-making process by clearly evaluating the environmental consequences of a proposed activity before action is taken. And so the key here is that balancing of the environment and the economy, or the social and the economic. It's really about helping that decision maker weigh the public interest. And often you'll hear this put forward as the decision maker needs to weigh the public interest, whether it's the federal government weighing the general Canadian citizens' public interest, or the BC government. It's really about what are the pros and cons of a project for the entire society, not just for this proponent and the people who live immediately nearby, but as a whole country, is this a good project that is going to be a net benefit to the country? EIA is a process to predict the environmental effects of proposed initiatives before they are carried out. So that's a pretty basic description. It's a good one. Now, I've got a few of mine in practice. So this is more coming from somebody who helps a proponent complete an environmental impact assessment, which is intended to help a decision maker decide whether it's in the public interest. So this is these are my definitions. So a characterization of the natural and human environment where a proposed, existing, or past project is located. So that's the baseline. That's kind of like our pre-EIA state. A science-based estimate of the measured or predicted impacts that the project might have on valued components of the human or natural environment. And the key here is on valued components. We don't just assess everything on the planet. We assess valued components. So these are things that people care about. This can be fish, moose, water quality, clean air, something that is specific and we can measure it. So although we can't measure clean air, we can measure particulate matter, we can measure lead, ambient concentrations, we can measure different indicators that can tell us, is that clean air? And again, we don't exactly measure a moose, but we can measure the abundance of moose, we can measure their habitat, we can measure specific things that can lead us to an assessment of whether the project will have an adverse effect on that specific valued component. Next, a process of identifying mitigations that can be applied to avoid or reduce the impacts. So this is an iterative process. We would do an assessment as a practitioner. If I find that a project is going to have an adverse impact on some valued component, I would then go to the proponent and I would say, look, this is probably not going to be an acceptable level of impact. Let's come up with some sort of a mitigation so that you can reduce the impact on that valued component, and then we'll reassess it. And so this can be highly iterative. Using a water quality example, if say a sewage treatment plant is going to have a discharge to Okanagan Lake. And this, of course, is a very real example because the city of Kelowna has a sewage treatment plant that discharges to Okanagan Lake. That discharge would have coliforms, nutrients, metals, a whole suite of parameters that we would look at. And so when this sewage treatment plant that exists in Kelowna was proposed, somebody would have looked at the phosphorus and said, look, this will change the status of the lake, the the trophic status of the lake. Let's implement phosphorus removal, and that's what they've done. And now there's a discharge to the lake that has a low level of phosphorus so that it doesn't affect Okanagan Lake. And so that assessment then would have been iterative, and the final assessment would have considered that mitigation before the sewage treatment plant was built. And sure enough, the plant was built with phosphorus removal, and that would have been a result of this iterative process. And so lastly, an EIA is the basis for government to decide whether the project is in the public interest. So does the project need it, or sorry, does the public need this project, or if they don't need it? So for example, an example of a project that the public might need is, for example, a mine for a strategic resource that the government needs, something, for example, an energy source like uranium, or a fertilizer like potash. Perhaps the government decides that we as a country need that resource, or perhaps the government may decide that we need the revenue from a specific resource. Whatever the case may be, that's up to the decision maker, and it's our job to help that decision maker understand the effects. Typically, I'm not going to touch too much on the economics of a project. That's usually the opposite of what we're doing. So we're looking at the adverse impacts, which are weighed against the economic or the strategic benefit of a project. So I'm going to focus on the environmental side. Of course, it's an EIA, but keep in mind that there's always an economic analysis and a social impact and other types of analyses that go into these that are part of the overall decision-making process, along with the environmental impacts that we're going to be talking about in this course. And of course, that plays into sustainable development. You've probably seen this sort of Venn diagram before. So sustainable development is the process of understanding environmental, social, and economic goals and how they fit together. And so, of course, sustainable development needs to consider all of these. So I'll just kind of go over some definitions. Sustainable development is also often defined as the use of a resource without compromising future generations' use of that resource. So there are different definitions of sustainable development. It's also defined as triple bottom line, in other words, environmental, social, and economic goals. So the use of resources to satisfy current needs without compromising future availability of those resources, or a matter of judgment balancing environmental, social, and economic objectives. So either way you look at it, they're quite different definitions, but highly complementary. And so an EIA needs to understand whether a project, or it needs to help the decision maker understand whether a project is sustainable. Not only does it help the decision maker, but it can actually push the project towards sustainability. If we see some adverse impact, we can help make it more sustainable. So as an environmental practitioner, this is actually a great benefit that you can have to the environment, to society, to the proponent, by using your knowledge and your expertise that you've learned as a scientist to help push that project into a more sustainable category by adding mitigation, by reducing the overall footprint, reducing the discharges, reducing air emissions, whatever it is that you specialize in, you can use your skills and your knowledge to help make that project more sustainable. So that's something else that I really like about working in environmental impact assessment. Okay, so where do we fit into this? So this is from the book that I showed earlier. This is Kevin Hanna's book. And in that book, they go chapter by chapter looking at different jurisdictions. And for each of the different jurisdictions, they have flowcharts of how the environmental impact assessment is done. So first, and again, this varies a little bit by jurisdiction, but it's fairly similar. So first, we decide whether an EIA or an EA is required. And so each different jurisdiction will have different triggers on what requires an EA. So for example, is it a mine? Is it a mine larger than X number of hectares, or a mill that does so many tons per day, or a pulp mill with a certain capacity? All of these different types of Projects have different triggers, and most of those are laid out in different jurisdictions. So we'll go through that a little bit throughout this course, mainly focusing on BC. And so this is the BC environmental assessment process. Although I think this is the 2002 process, just if I remember correctly. It's changed a little bit, but not drastically. It's still generally the same process. So is the EA required? In other words, is it reviewable? Is it prescribed by the regulation? If so, the EAO, that's the Environmental Assessment Office, will set the scope, procedure, and methods. In other words, so they'll set out a terms of reference that the proponent must follow, and by the proponent, that means some company is responsible for making sure it happens, meaning that it will be some sort of an environmental practitioner like yourselves who makes it happen. So the EAO issues an application information requirements, and this will be a long list. It's basically a terms of reference that says you must assess all of these different impacts. You must make sure you've covered all of these different types of effects in your assessment. EAO screens the application, proponent prepares and submits application for EA certificate. So that's essentially what we're going to be focusing on. So this entire course is going to focus on this one box. Proponent prepares and submits application for the EA process, or for an application for an EA certificate. So that's an environmental assessment certificate, which is essentially the approval issued by the Environmental Assessment Office. Okay, so then the EAO screens the application, reviews the application, and the director issues an assessment report. The decision is then made by the minister whether to approve or not approve. Typically, it will be approved with a large number of conditions, so the EA certificate, and the certificate will have those conditions attached to them, which lay out permitting, monitoring, compliance, and enforcement. So as I said, we're going to focus here. I will actually go over a little bit of what follows after the preparation of the assessment. So, for example, approvals, adaptive management, etc. But probably 80% of our course is going to be on this one oval with some discussion of the later conditions. And the reason for that is that these later conditions will relate back to that original assessment. So if there's an area of uncertainty, that will typically result in conditions in the approval that say you must follow up on this uncertainty that was identified in the impact assessment by implementing adaptive management, or by monitoring, or by completing a further assessment. Whatever the case may be, everything that follows down through this approval process will stem from that environmental impact assessment document. Similarly, in the Alberta chapter in the same book, I found this a little bit amusing actually, that a lot of this focuses on the initial processes of screening and terms of reference preparation. So the government will look at the project, understand whether it needs an EA. Typically that's going to be yes for any sort of a major undertaking, like a mine, a pulp mill, major development in a park, anything that can have a significant adverse impact on the environment. So it will go through this screening process, and then the government will prepare a terms of reference. And in this chapter, basically it goes from terms of reference to submission of the EA report, but it actually kind of skips over the entire part of this course, which is going to be the preparation of that report. So we're going to focus on this part here. After the report is submitted, it goes through technical reviews. There will be a public decision and the approvals and follow-up, just like in BC. Similarly, we have a national process. It's got the same sort of components to that. So the proponent is going to submit a project description to the government. The government will determine whether or not an EA is required. For any large project, that's going to be yes, an EA is required. There will be a public notification period, draft guidelines, public comment on the guidelines, issue final guidelines to the proponent. So that's referred to as the EIS guidelines. which is basically the same as what I referred to earlier as the terms of reference or an application information requirements. So an application information requirements is what they use in BC, the terms of reference in Alberta, EIS guidelines federal. It's all the same thing, just different terminology. It basically lays out all the requirements of your environmental assessment. Okay, but in this course, again, we're going to focus on this part here, which is the preparation of the environmental impact statement. Following that, there will be the submission, there will be a review, and this can be a very lengthy process. This can be 5 years or more, depending on the size of the project and the level of public participation. There'll be an EA report and then an EA decision, which is that public interest decision that we talked about. And here we go, the relationship between prediction and significance. So this is what we really need to get to. It doesn't matter which jurisdiction we're in. At the end of the day, the regulator needs to make that significance determination so that they can weigh that against economic and other variables to make that public interest decision. So these are the different things that we help them understand. So we'll do modeling and experiments, we'll use GIS, professional and expert opinion, traditional ecological knowledge, local indigenous knowledge, scenario analysis. These are all sort of the different analysis methods. We'll use that to come up with some prediction, and that prediction will be specific to our component or our discipline. And so by component or discipline, I mean air quality, water quality, hydrology, fisheries, noise. These are the components or disciplines. And within each of those, we'll come up with a table that shows the magnitude and direction. So magnitude means how big is the effect. Direction means is it getting worse or better. Spatial extent, how wide of an area does it cover? So the duration, is it something that happens for a day, for a year, forever? Other dimensions, synergism, likelihood, and accumulation. So synergism means two things act together, and when they act together, they are larger than the sum of their individual parts. So this can be two chemicals that interact to become more poisonous than taking the two individually. It can be any other sort of environmental effect where two things add up to be worse than they would be individually. Likelihood is, even though we've made these predictions, are they actually likely to occur, or is this just some model telling us, some magnitude, duration, and spatial extent, but it's actually not that likely to happen because there's other factors that could intervene? Accumulation, so do things get worse? Do they build up? And then reversibility and resilience. Is this something that will have an effect on the environment, but then can be reclaimed or recovered at the end of the project, or is this something that is going to permanently adversely affect species? For example, is there rare species or an endangered species that we're going to permanently adversely affect? So all of this leads into the significance of the project. Of course, then there's the public interest, legal requirements. These are all other factors that need to be considered. So really all of this is sort of what we're going to try and understand for our component throughout this course. Okay, so decision making. So EIA practitioners are not the decision makers. We help the decision makers make their decision. So to the extent possible, we need to make sure that we are unbiased, so we can't form preconceptions. We can't be for or against the project. Even though naturally we will have some sort of opinion, we need to keep our opinion out of our work. We need to be objective. Okay, so keep the assessment entirely based on facts, not our opinions. Although professional opinion is fine, professional opinion is different from our personal opinion. Professional opinion can help us understand what's the best tool to use, what's the best sort of assumption to make for an assessment, but it doesn't mean inserting our values into a project. That's the big difference. Is we can insert our professional opinion, which is as objective as we can make it, and it's going to be based on facts, it's going to be based on previous experience, but not based on our values. So to the extent possible, we need to keep our values out of it, and we need to be independent observers. So we work on behalf of the proponent, but we don't advocate for a proponent. We don't say, this is a great project, you should approve it. We say, this project will or will not have adverse impacts, and to the degree that it has an adverse impact, this is the magnitude and the spatial extent, et cetera, et cetera. We stick to objective facts in our assessment. We try and be informative. We provide enough information so that the decision makers can make an informed decision, and so that they can rely on our interpretation and our assessment. So, as I've said here, in an EIA, it's difficult, if not impossible, to avoid forming an opinion. We are human after all, but our challenge is to remain impartial in our work, regardless of our profession and regardless of our personal opinion. So it doesn't matter if you like a project or don't like a project, you can still assess it very impartially using objective measures. I mean, I find that fairly straightforward. Being a chemist, I can measure a chemical, I can predict that chemical concentration into the future. And for me, because I don't deal with biological endpoints, I deal with chemical endpoints, it's actually a pretty neutral type of topic to deal with. Other topics, though, if you really love fish, I could see it being fairly difficult to do a fisheries assessment without getting a little bit emotionally attached to the end product. So depending on which component of an EIA you're working on, this might be more or less difficult, but regardless, you've got to keep your assessment as objective as possible. Okay, so decisions that EIA practitioners can support. So as a practitioner, we're not a decision maker, we're a decision supporter. So we can help the proponent decide, should the project be built? If we see a fatal flaw in a project, for example, some things are pretty much no-brainers. If some project is going to make a whole bunch of rare species go extinct, for example, that's pretty much a no-brainer. The project's just not going to get approved anyway, so it's kind of pointless to go through an assessment. How can environmental impacts be minimized or avoided? That's where most of our work comes in. It's not so much about, yes, build the project, or no, don't build the project. That's really above our pay grade as EIA practitioners. That's really more up to the shareholders, up to the government, up to the company themselves. As an EIA practitioner, this is where we can really do the most good. We can help design mitigation to minimize impacts so that the project can proceed as environmentally friendly as possible. We can also help them understand alternatives. So it's not just about mitigating an impact, it's about doing the project in a different way that will help them meet their project's objectives, but with less impact on the environment. And so when it comes to alternatives, this is really something that you learn with a lot of time and experience, when you learn there's different and better ways of doing things. But in the early years of doing an environmental impact assessment, this is actually fairly straightforward as well. How to minimize, how to mitigate. We will talk about alternatives assessment though, because it's actually one of the more interesting parts of an environmental impact assessment. Okay, so for the government, we can help them as practitioners. Is the project in the public interest? So we don't decide that, but we can give the government the information that helps them decide that. What conditions are necessary to protect the environment? In other words, if the government is going to approve a project, what are the conditions that they can write into that approval, which will then be enforceable, that can be followed up on through compliance reporting in annual reports, etc., that will help minimize uncertainty and help the government understand that the project is being carried out in an environmentally sustainable way. So an example of that might be if we do an assessment and at the end of the assessment we have a high level of uncertainty around some specific effect, we would say, there is moderate to high uncertainty, there is high uncertainty, whatever the case may be, which can be reduced over time through monitoring this very specific thing. So we need to be very specific in these recommendations. Otherwise, it's really impossible for some third party to look at this and to understand how can the project be carried out sustainably while reducing that uncertainty over time. And then for stakeholders, which values will be impacted? Again, I talked about components or valued ecosystem components, which of those will be impacted and how, to what degree. Is the assessment credible? So we can help the public by communicating clearly and by being very transparent in our methods. In other words, we're using methods that are well established, that are laid out in a technical appendix or in some report that somebody can follow from start to finish to understand exactly how we did our assessment and how we've reached our conclusions. Okay, so let's move on and talk about the Site C project. So this is going to be our case study, and I'm going to use this throughout the semester to hopefully help you understand EIS a little bit better, or EIA a little bit better. So the proponent was BC Hydro. That's a Crown Corporation of BC. In other words, it's an arm's length owned company by the government. The EIA was conducted pursuant to SIA 2012 and BC EAA, I think it was 2002. And so I think if you look at the BC Assessment Office, I think there was a new act in 2018. This was under the old act, but really for the purposes of completing an EIA as a practitioner, as a technical practitioner, there's not a whole lot of difference, even though there are quite a few differences at the high level in terms of consultation, et cetera, and how the overall assessment is done on an individual component basis. They're still generally the same technical type of work. So, as homework before our next class, please go read the executive summary. You don't have to write down that link. I've posted that on Canvas, so you can just click on it. But read the executive summary. It will give you a very good overview of the project, and you'll have a good understanding of the different components, the different potential effects, and really just that'll set you up well for this course. So please do that within the next week. Go read that executive summary. Okay, but I'll give you a quick overview of the project. So this is northern BC. In case you're not familiar with this region, this is Dawson Creek, Fort St. John. This is the Peace River flowing from the W.A.C. Bennett Dam through Dinosaur Reservoir into Alberta. This then flows basically due east across Alberta and then due north into Great Slave Lake. So the Peace River is a very large river. I think it's the second largest river in BC after the Fraser. W.A.C. Bennett Dam forms Williston Lake, which is actually the largest lake in BC. It's not a natural lake, it's a reservoir, but it's the largest water body in BC. So it's a large amount of water. Now, the interesting thing about this project is that the Bennett Dam was built in 1967. Following that, the Dinosaur Reservoir was built behind the Peace Canyon Dam. And so over 50 years ago, the flow regime of the Peace River was essentially permanently altered. So the Site C, as you'll see throughout the assessment, has a fairly limited impact on the river flow because it's already been impacted. And so what made this an interesting project is that there was no environmental impact assessment done on the W.A.C. Bennett Dam. That was over 50 years ago. That was before EIA existed. And so now the challenge with this project is we don't have a true baseline. There was no comprehensive baseline carried out because there was no EIA. So it makes it difficult for a practitioner and for a decision maker, for the government, for example, to understand how do you truly assess the effects of this project? What do you compare the future project to? Do you compare it to today, which is already impacted, or do you compare it to pre-development, which was never measured and which will never again exist? So there are some schools of thought that would say you should compare it to pre-development. I definitely, understand that point of view. We should be comparing to pre-development, but from a practical point of view, there's some serious limitations to our knowledge going back over 50 years to a time when things weren't measured very well. And there's some practical limitations to that understanding, to applying future effects of a project to a scenario that will probably never again exist. In other words, unless we're going to break that W.C. Bennett Dam and restore the Williston back to rivers, which is pretty unlikely, the significance of comparing it to pre-development is pretty questionable. So it's kind of a philosophical thing that we need to grapple with as practitioners. What do we set as our baseline? So I'll talk a lot about that when we talk about baselines, but kind of a digression. What you need to understand is that the Peace River has two dams on it already. Peace River flows near Fort St. John, which is the site of the future dam, which is actually being built today. And then it flows into Alberta. There are also a lot of effects around the Peace Athabasca Delta, which I'll talk about in detail later through the semester because it's a pretty complicated process. So as you're looking through the executive summary, have a look at all the different components that were assessed. So they're called technical studies in the EIS. So geology, terrain and soil, surface water regime, water quality, groundwater, thermal and ice, fluvial geomorphology, methylmercury, microclimate, air quality, noise and vibration. There are actually quite a few more than this, but this is just sort of how the EIS is compartmentalized. And within each of these technical studies, there are valued components. So my specialty is water quality. This is actually, as you'll look through those reports, you might see my name on them. These feed into VCs. So water quality is not in itself a valued component, but the water quality affects fish and fish habitat, and it affects human health because people drink the water. And you'll notice that fish and fish habitat shows up in a number of different areas. So that's affected by noise, methylmercury, thermal and ice regime, water quality, surface water regime. I'm sure it's in here. Yes, there it is. Same with human health. So these two components are usually the most important VCs of an EA because, of course, we always care about human health and we almost always care about fish and fish habitat. Unless it's some sort of an EA that has no effect on water, you're almost always going to see these two components and you're going to see them frequently. So human health is affected by methylmercury. Let's see how many places it shows up in here. I'm sure it shows up in here somewhere. No? Anyway, you'll see human health shows up in a number of places. Fluvial geomorphology, air quality, noise and vibration. All of these things affect human health, electrical and magnetic fields. So have a look at the technical studies because you're going to need to choose one of these to focus on for your major project. So find one that is interesting to you, something you'd like to learn more about, and also you can look at the valued components, and if something in here interests you, then that will help you with your project as well. Again, more project components, how they affect valued components, effects avoided or mitigated. So this is from the executive summary. This is BC Hydro's kind of talking about how they've mitigated effects, or sorry, which effects were avoided or mitigated. And then these are the measures that they took to mitigate the effect. So for example, extended shoreline protection, modified spillway design, these are all different mitigations. So Site C is actually quite an interesting project. It's interesting because it was complex, so technically interesting. But in the years since I worked on that project, I think we went to a hearing in 2014 actually. Either way though, it's been 6 or 7 years. A lot has happened. A lot of people have come out in opposition to the project. A lot of those people have come out on economic grounds saying that BC doesn't need the electricity that the dam will generate, or they come out on grounds of saying that the government was hiding their reason for building the dam and that it's actually just going to go into oil and gas production. All sorts of controversies have come up from this project. It's also gone from about a $5 billion project to, I think the latest estimate was over $12 billion. So every year or two, BC becomes a political quagmire. It was a big problem during the last election. And when the NDPs took over from the Liberals, they went on this big cross-province tour to see if they should basically undo all the work that's already been done and take a $2 billion loss on the project. As of the present day, which is January 2021, the project is still going ahead. And on the Canvas page, I've linked to a few videos that kind of give you an update on the project, although they're a little bit out of date. It does show what's happening with the project. And you can go on Google or Google News or YouTube, whatever, and look at some of the controversy. It's quite interesting. I think it'll make the project for us a little bit more interesting because it's always in the news. It's always kind of fun to work on a project that's in the news. So here's their construction schedule. So it was approved, I think at the end of 2014, might have been early 2015, but this is essentially when they got their approvals. And so what's happened since then, dam clearing, access roads, worker accommodations, construction bridge, all of that is done because this is a Gantt chart, and I'm actually going to go over Gantt charts in a couple of weeks when we talk about project management. But essentially each of these is a timeline for a specific task. And if you look now, we're pretty much here. I did check their website. They don't have an updated Gantt chart. The most recent one's almost a year old, but it looks just like this, so I haven't updated this. So essentially, these are essentially up to date. So excavation and material relocation is still ongoing. Earth-filled dams being built, generating station and spillways, turbines and generators. And I saw in the news 2 days ago that the turbines had actually just arrived, I think at Prince Rupert. So they are literally at this moment being shipped to the Site C dam. They've got some highways shut down as they make their way to the dam. So that's kind of an up-to-date update on what's happening. So what's left, transmission lines have yet to be built. Site reclamation is planned to happen in 2 years, although I think it's fair to say that will be behind schedule. Anyway, it's an interesting project. It's a major, major project. I've got a couple of links to videos on the Canvas site that you can, they're short videos, 2, 3, 4 minutes. You can have a look and just kind of see the scope and the magnitude of the project. But again, feel free to go and look online and find whatever else might interest you. So look at the list of technical reports on the registry. This is also linked on Canvas. So the entire environmental impact statement is listed on the registry, so you can look at all of the technical appendices. So look at volume 2. You're going to pick one of those technical appendices, and that will be the focus of your assessment report. So it's a quarter of your mark. It's a big chunk of work, so take your time and pick something that you're really interested in. So you're going to select your choice of technical disciplines. Again, look at the executive summary that kind of gives you an overview of that technical discipline, and then look at the CIA website, which has the full breakdown of the technical reports. Bring your choice to the first couple of labs. You're not locked in that first lab. I'll have a conversation with you and make sure that you understand what you're getting yourself into. But you don't want to wait more than a couple of weeks into the semester to have your final project locked in. Okay, so if you can form your own team, do that. If not, I will help people sign up. But again, it's much better if you can form your own groups. And again, it doesn't matter if your group members are all in the same lab session or section. It will make things a little easier for you, but there's no requirement. It will just be kind of easier if you are. So keep that in mind. Also, if you're registered in lab session 1, I don't care if you come to lab session 2 instead. It makes no difference to me whatsoever. So feel free to partner up as you wish. But it is important that you can actually get together with your partners at some times. So that is the course in a nutshell. I'm looking forward to being with you for the next 3 or 4 months. Hopefully you'll learn a lot about environmental impact assessment, but probably for me more importantly is you just learn some of the process of working in a multidisciplinary setting, which is really important for earth and environmental science. And you learn some other skills like project management, modeling and writing, and some of these more generalizable skills. So whatever it is that you hope to get from the course, I hope you do. And I'm looking forward to seeing you in person, virtually, in the labs. So I'll see you there. Have a great week.